Ben stared at his clock, the green numbers glowing against the dark. 3:17 a.m. The grueling week of exams was finally over, and he had barely managed to crawl into bed, his body aching for sleep. He fell into unconsciousness almost instantly. A few hours later, Ben stirred, realizing he was awake. But something was wrong. He couldn't move. His body felt trapped, every muscle locked in place as though weighed down by an invisible force. His chest tightened, and he struggled to inhale fully. Panic surged, but he remained utterly still, pinned to his mattress. He tried to scream, but his voice was silenced, caught in his throat. All he could do was move his eyes, darting around his dim room. Silence pressed down, thick and absolute, as though the world outside had simply ceased to exist. In the shadows, Ben's eyes caught something, movement, subtle at first, in the corner where the darkness seemed impossibly deep. His gaze fixed on it, and he realized he wasn't alone. There was a figure there, a form that seemed almost human but somehow wrong, like a twisted echo of a person. The shadow's outline was unclear, flickering between a defined shape and a blur, yet something about its presence was overwhelming, choking the room's air. It was tall, disturbingly thin, and although it lacked any discernible face, Ben felt it was watching him intently, as though it had waited a long time for this moment. Slowly, with a smooth, fluid motion, the figure began to glide forward, moving noiselessly, each step carrying a cold, creeping tread into Ben's chest. It was close enough now that Ben could make out the silhouette of what might have been its head, craned downwards as if to look directly into his face. Ben's heart pounded in his chest, the sound deafening to his own ears, but he could do nothing but stare in frozen horror. The shadow leaned closer, its cold, dark hand extending. The moment it touched his forehead, an icy shock coursed through his skull, paralyzing his mind as much as his body. Ben could feel thoughts slipping away, his sense of self dimming as though his consciousness were being drained. A faint whisper echoed in his ears, repeating his name in a voice that was both familiar and alien, resonating from somewhere beyond the veil of reality. Ben. The sound cut through his mind like a knife, a low, resonant murmur that didn't just come from the shadow, it seemed to come from within him, as if his own mind had turned against him. The room grew darker, colder, his sight dimming as though he were being drawn into an endless void. Then, as suddenly as it began, the sensation lifted. With a gasping breath, Ben shot up in bed, the paralysis gone. His room appeared unchanged, every object in its place, yet he felt the residual chill of the shadow's touch lingering on his skin. He frantically looked to the corner, only to find it still cloaked in shadow, darker than it should have been, almost as if the memory of the figure refused to leave. Ben sat there, trembling, trying to convince himself it had been just a dream. But the icy touch on his forehead and the whispered echo of his name wouldn't fade. In that shadowy corner, it felt as though he was still being watched. Ethan rolled into bed, feeling the weight of the day seep into his bones. It had been months since his grandmother's passing, yet the sharp pang of loss still throbbed in his chest every night. He shut his eyes, hoping for the comfort of sleep, his mind trailing off to memories of her gentle smile, her warm embrace, and the quiet wisdom she'd always offered him. As the night deepened, silence wrapped around his room, so heavy it felt almost tangible. His body slowly drifted off, succumbing to a dark, dreamless sleep until something disturbed the peace. Ethan's eyes snapped open, only to find himself staring at the ceiling. A cold sweat broke on his brow as he quickly realized that he was unable to move a single muscle. His body was locked, immobilized, though his mind was fully awake, acutely aware of every sound, every shift in the room's atmosphere. An invisible weight pressed down on his chest, making it nearly impossible to breathe deeply. Panic surged, his heart hammering against his ribs in frantic beats. He could only move his eyes, scanning the room as best as he could, when he felt it, the unmistakable presence of someone else in the room. A familiar energy, almost comforting yet terrifying in the same instant, filled the space. In the corner near his closet, a shadow began to take form. Slowly, almost painstakingly, it transformed, its edges becoming defined, details emerging from the darkness. His heart stilled for a moment as he recognized the figure. Though her form was faint and blurred, he knew the contours of her face, the tilt of her shoulders, and even the way she held her hands softly in front of her. It was her, his grandmother. She was there, just as he remembered her on Sunday mornings in her favorite linen dress. His grandmother's eyes, though empty, held a deep, indescribable warmth, as though she could see straight through him. She stood there, watching him, an unreadable expression on her face. Ethan wanted to call out to her, to say her name, but his voice was trapped within his throat. He could only lie there, a spectator in his own body, his gaze fixed on the figure who could not possibly be standing there. Then, she began to move closer, her steps soundless, gliding toward his bed. With each inch she closed between them, the room grew colder, the chill creeping into his bones. Finally, she was standing beside him, her presence overwhelming, and she extended a hand, reaching toward his face. Ethan's pulse pounded as her cold fingers gently touched his forehead. A strange calm washed over him, soothing his anxiety, dulling the edge of his fear. He felt enveloped in a sense of peace that he hadn't known since her passing, a warmth hidden within the coldness of her touch, as if she were giving him one last moment of comfort. Just as he began to accept her presence, she pulled back, her hand retracting as she started moving toward the door. She paused once, turning to look at him a final time, her expression now unreadable, perhaps even sad. And as silently as she had appeared, she dissolved back into the shadows, vanishing as if she had never been there. Ethan's chest suddenly released, and with a jolt, he could move again. He sat up, breathless, his hands shaking as he touched his forehead, where the cold from her touch still lingered. He glanced around the room, half expecting to see her standing there still, but there was only the emptiness of his dark room. Had it been a dream? Or a trick of the mind in his sleep-deprived state? But he knew, deep down, that it was something more. The weight of her presence still filled the room, leaving behind a strange serenity, a sense of closure he couldn't explain. Ethan lay back down, feeling a calm that he hadn't felt in weeks, a reassurance that somehow she was at peace, and perhaps now he could be too. Lucas, an average guy with a stable job and routine, lives alone in a modest, cluttered apartment. He doesn't socialize much, and his apartment reflects this, cluttered with books, half-empty cups of coffee, and piles of laundry. On the far side of his bedroom stands an old, tarnished mirror, ornate but weathered. When Lucas moved in, he'd always meant to replace it, but eventually, he forgot about it. After an exhausting week at work, Lucas collapses onto his bed, hoping for a peaceful night. But at around 3 a.m., he suddenly awakens, aware of a heavy, oppressive silence filling the room. His limbs feel leaden, pinned to the mattress. Lucas immediately recognizes the sensation as sleep paralysis, but this time, it feels disturbingly different. Unable to move, his gaze drifts involuntarily to the mirror, and his heart nearly stops. In the dark glass, he sees his own face, but it's wrong. His reflection is hazy, with distorted features. The eyes seem shadowed, empty yet fixated on him with a look that radiates something close to hunger. Frozen in place, Lucas stares back, heart pounding, feeling a chill crawl down his spine. Lucas finally breaks out of the paralysis, jolting awake. He tries to shake off the experience, dismissing it as a trick of the mind, a figment of exhaustion, and decides to ignore it. But the following nights bring the same haunting vision, each time with the reflection becoming clearer and more sinister. He begins to notice unsettling details. The face in the mirror looks thinner, paler, with dark, empty eyes that no longer seem human. And, night after night, the reflection's lips move, forming silent words that he can't quite make out. Sleep deprived and increasingly paranoid, Lucas tries to avoid the mirror. He tells himself it's just his mind playing tricks, that he's seeing things due to lack of sleep. But the figure in the reflection grows more lifelike, almost independent of him. Soon, Lucas is seeing the distorted face even during the day, and other reflective surfaces, the bathroom mirror, the darkened screen of his phone, even the window on his commute home. Each time, the face in the reflection seems a little closer, a little clearer. Lucas's sanity begins to crumble. He can barely eat or sleep, consumed by the growing sense of terror that his reflection is alive, lurking just beneath the surface of every reflective surface. His reflection doesn't mimic his actions anymore. It watches him, mocking him, an entity with its own twisted consciousness. And when he does sleep, the face appears in his dreams, closer than ever, whispering his name in a low, guttural tone he can feel in his bones. Driven to the edge, Lucas decides to cover the mirror, then moves it out of his bedroom altogether. He convinces himself that his terror will fade now that the mirror is gone, but he's wrong. That night, after a brief sense of peace, he wakes again in the dead of night, locked in a paralyzed state. The room is pitch dark, and he desperately tries to convince himself he's safe. He no longer feels the oppressive gaze until he hears a faint creak, as if something is moving. Forcing his eyes open, he sees it, the mirror, back in its place at the foot of his bed, with the twisted face pressing closer against the glass than ever before. Lucas's own face, his true face, stares back in silent terror as the reflection slowly raises a hand, clawing at the glass, as if trying to break free. The fingers stretch out, warped and elongated, scraping against the inner surface of the mirror, leaving dark, smudged lines. Morning arrives, and Lucas, pale and haggard, stares at his reflection, which now mirrors his every move with chilling accuracy. But he can no longer escape the shadow in the mirror. It's inside him now, a permanent mark on his existence. He wraps the mirror and stores it away, locking it in his basement, but even in the daylight, he feels its presence. As he leaves the room, a shiver runs through him. He turns back one last time and catches sight of the mirror in the corner of his eye. There, beyond his own reflection, he sees the distorted face, smiling at him, eyes dark with hunger that will never fade.